out and who takes part in a conversation with him that was recorded, you see really different sides of this man. And here what they're talking about is they're reminiscing. They're starting by reminiscing on the Nixon administration response to the Pentagon Papers and to the break-in of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist. And it's a classic case where you get the different sides of Richard Nixon. On the one hand, you've got Nixon saying the break-in was crazy. And on the other hand, when talking about other issues like the Moore-Radford affair, an extremely sensitive issue from the Nixon administration, and there are many records and tapes today that have not yet been released by the government because it is still sensitive today. On the other hand, Nixon says if there are further leaks, like the Ellsberg leak, like the Pentagon Papers, Nixon says, I'll do it again.
You can send your questions or chats to me or for Luke Nichter by using your Facebook or Twitter login just beneath me on your screen, and we'd love to hear from you and whatever questions you have about the Nixon presidency or the Nixon tapes for Luke or for me. It seemed to me in that conversation, Luke, that at this very sensitive juncture when Nixon has just had to fire his top aides and there's talk of a special prosecutor soon to be appointed, it struck me that Nixon and Kissinger were kind of circling each other warily here, trying to get a feel for how the other might testify if one or both were forced to do so, to the point where Kissinger is saying, well, of course, I never knew about these various break-ins and investigations, words to that effect, and Nixon saying, doesn't make a difference, and you don't run away from John Ehrlichman. And of course, we should point out that very few people knew the president was taping. Nixon knew. Bob Haldeman, the departed chief of staff, knew, and his aides, some of his aides knew. But Kissinger, by all accounts, did not know. It seems to me in that conversation, he seems to have a vague apprehension that he was being recorded. Do you agree?
I do agree, and that's one of the things you see not just in this conversation, but in these other 340 hours released this past week, is you have aides like Kissinger who didn't know about the system, Chuck Colson didn't know about the system, Nixon's top domestic advisor Ehrlichman did not know about the system. I think the suspicions are beginning to rise about to record. I mean, Kissinger had it was no secret that Kissinger had his own recording system in his own office, so it wouldn't be out of the question and there was nothing illegal about it at the time, that Nixon might have his own recording system. So you're right, at the time when there's talk of the special prosecutor being set up, the Senate, the Ervin Committee, the Senate Watergate Committee, so you have kind of two competing investigations that are building momentum, and it's kind of inevitable at the time of this conversation that White House records are going to be subpoenaed, current or former White House staff working for either Nixon or Kissinger are going to be subpoenaed for testimony. So Nixon and Kissinger are in on that together. They share that concern, but their concerns differ a little bit because they kind of have different interests. They have different points of their careers. They have different futures ahead of them. So they also have their own unique way that they're reacting to the events of 1973 that are going on at the time of this conversation.
You make a great point, Luke, about Kissinger also having done extensive telephone recording of his talks with foreign leaders, and a lot of those conversations have been published in a book that was put out by the National Security Archive. I think it bears the title, The Kissinger Telcons. Let's move along to our next conversation. That was the longest one that we're going to play today, folks, by the way. It was just under 5 minutes. The next 5 conversations we're going to run through are each about a minute long. And we're going to take two segments from an Oval Office conversation that was recorded on May 3, 1973, so really the day after the conversation we just heard. And this features President Nixon talking with Ambassador David K.E. Bruce of the State Department. Tell our viewers, Luke, who David K.E. Bruce was.
Yeah, just to set this up, David K.E. Bruce was one of our most distinguished American ambassadors of the entire 20th century. He served Republican presidents, Democratic presidents. He served at some of our biggest embassies overseas, and he was basically retired by the time of this conversation. And so Nixon brings him out of retirement, brings him into the Oval Office, and says, you're going to go work for me, and you're going to be our first ambassador to China, and you're going to set up, it wasn't yet called the embassy, but you're going to set up our liaison office in Peking.
In what was then called Peking, now obviously Beijing. Let's listen to Richard Nixon, President Nixon, talking with Ambassador David K.E. Bruce on May 3rd, 1973 in the Oval Office.
We're trying to see what this gray area, we've got to get along with this 1/4 of all people in the world, the ablest people in the world, in my opinion. We've got to get along with them, or it's no problem for the next 5 years, but for the next 20 years, it's the critical problem of our age. Yeah, that's it. Yes, I think. And the other thing is, if you could constantly, of course, whenever you're talking, they're very subtle, but and they're not like the Russians who, of course, slaughter and flattery and all that sort of thing. But you should let them know how two things. One, from a personal standpoint, how much I appreciate it. My wife appreciates how well you're there. Second, that we look forward to some kind of return. Third, we would very much hope that Joe and I see his way clear to come here to the U.S.
As you know, historian Luke Nichter joining us from Austin, President Nixon pursued a kind of triangulation strategy with the two major communist powers, China and the USSR, and the opening to China was part of that, right?
That's right, and I think what's interesting about this conversation is not just that you have the kind of fly-on-the-wall moment. Here you have the actual words that Nixon spoke as he was charging David Bruce, and who was on his way to China. But you have Nixon kind of telling him, in a sense, how to do his job. And here you have David Bruce, who had been more or less a career diplomat going back to his OSS days during World War II, and operating during that career under kind of State Department protocol and rules. And Nixon's telling him, when you go to China, you know, one of the most important things are not going to be your official duties, but your unofficial duties. And you should be very active socially. And what I'd like you to do is, if you look at the aging Chinese leaders, Chairman Mao at the time and Premier Zhou Enlai, they're old, and there's no successors that have been publicized or handpicked. There's no kind of next up-and-coming generation of Chinese young political elite. And Nixon says to Bruce that I'd like you to kind of, on the social scene, kind of feel out what we can expect in terms of future Chinese leaders. And I'd like you to report back to me, and I'd like you to do so by not going through the State Department. Use a back-channel communication and report it only to me. You are to be my ambassador, not the State Department's ambassador.
Well, in fact, we have a photograph that shows Ambassador Bruce with Henry Kissinger in what was then called Peking, seated with the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. And obviously this post-dated the conversation we just heard, but let's play another clip from the Nixon-Bruce conversation in which, in fact, the President makes just the sentiments you just described, Luke, really giving voice to the President's deep suspicions about the State Department. Let's listen. Very briefly, Luke, why was President Nixon suspicious of the State Department?
Well, I think he was suspicious because here what you have are very sensitive details being collected on Chinese political leadership. And I think, obviously, it's a common sense, I think, that the more hands that information passes through, if it goes up to the liaison office, over to the State Department, and then back down into Washington and into the White House, the more hands the information passes through, the greater the likelihood there are leaks. And in this case, Nixon's not concerned so much that the leaks would embarrass him, it's that the leaks would embarrass the Chinese. And this momentum that Nixon has at this stage with the Chinese and building relations, he doesn't want to jeopardize that and take any chance at all that Bruce's assignment would do that.
I think also it's fair to say that Nixon's suspicion of the State Department dated back to his pursuit of State Department official Alger Hiss as a spy, a conviction in which Nixon was ultimately validated by